If you haven't yet listened to the press conference from Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron announcing the grand jury's decision in the Breonna Taylor case, you really should. It addresses every lingering question and every activist demand calmly with the facts, the applicable law, and the principles on which our legal system is based, which of course means it will be summarily ignored in favor of reporting that fuels misunderstanding and chaos. But Daniel Cameron did his damnedest. He did an admirable job. His presentation was factually sound in a way you'll never hear on the news, and it was philosophically sound in a way you'll never see on Twitter. His only flaw, in my judgment, was an appeal to our national character that immediately aged poorly. He asked, who do we want to be as a country? A hysterical mob or a system of law and order?
In our system, criminal justice isn't the quest for revenge. It's the quest for truth. Our reaction to the truth today says what kind of society we want to be. Do we really want the truth, or do we want a truth that fits our narrative? Do we want the facts, or are we content to blindly accept our own version of events?
Well, it sure is nice to dream of a country where we'd at least stop to consider that question, but of course we don't. The mob was already mobbing, or at least getting its mob prep work done before he even finished asking the question. And it turns out, not only do we want the narrative, but we want it written in scorched earth and blood. Before the grand jury's charging decision was even announced, Louisville businesses were closing and boarding up like some freak inland hurricane was about to hit, and honestly, I'm sure many would have preferred a hurricane instead. Riots, as usual, destroyed storefronts. 130 people were arrested the first night alone, and of course, the night's feature presentation was the shooting of 2 police officers. Thankfully, both are expected to survive, and the white supremacist agitator behind the attack has been detained. Yeah, sure, it was tense, but let's acknowledge that this attempted murder, just like the rest around the country, was also mostly peaceful. And let's not ignore the real controversy here. The fact that a Louisville police officer called these punks exactly what they are, a bunch of punks. In a somehow controversial email, Major Bridget Hallahan said these Antifa and Black Lives Matter agitators are punks with no character or morals. She said they'll be washing cars and cashiering at Walmart, playing Call of Duty in their parents' basements their entire lives. The only thing controversial about that statement is that it's too generous, actually. It's that it credits these people with the capability of working hard and earning an honest living. They don't, and they won't. These are people who believe they can just take it from you. And as this week demonstrates, they will try to do that violently the second they can craft a claim of entitlement. But anyway, back to the point, all of this was pre-planned. Daniel Cameron could have executed the cops himself, Game of Thrones style, live on the stream, and these people would still have rioted. The U-Hauls were already loaded up and on site after all, and of course, Mom's gonna be really pissed if she paid that rental fee for nothing. Lucky for them, they chose pretty generic language for their signs, because every specific activist mantra about Breonna Taylor was thoroughly addressed and debunked during Cameron's press conference. Arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. Why is it taking so long? Why don't we have more information? These have been trendy demands and questions all spring and summer long, implying there's something nefarious afoot. No, there's a process afoot. Investigations take time. And by the way, the Attorney General is bound by state law not to discuss them publicly.
The Kentucky rules are clear that I'm prohibited from making comments that could sway public opinion or heighten public condemnation of those involved in the case. These are crucial rules to ensure due process under the Constitution.
And if you just wait for that process to play out, you'll see that many of the original claims of fact were bunk. Oh, she was just sleeping when she was shot. No, she wasn't. She and her boyfriend were both up and attentive, ready to shoot, actually.
Sergeant Mattingly identified 2 individuals standing beside one another at the end of the hall, a male and a female. The male was holding a gun, arms extended, in a shooting stance.
Yeah, well, what would you do if police just stormed your home if they don't knock or announce? That creates the impression of a home invasion. That was the argument. But that, too, is not what happened. Police were advised to knock and announce.
The officers were advised by superiors to knock and announce their presence in serving this specific search warrant.
And so they did, and not just according to the police themselves, but according to an independent witness, too.
Evidence shows that officers both knocked and announced their presence at the apartment. The officers' statements about their announcement are corroborated by an independent witness.
Yeah, well, they should have knocked harder or yelled louder. They shouldn't have just stormed in there. Worth noting that only one of the police officers actually entered the property, and he was shot immediately.
After breaching the door, Sergeant Mattingly was the first and only officer to enter the residence. Sergeant Mattingly saw the man's gun fire, heard a boom, and immediately knew he was shot as a result of feeling heat in his upper thigh.
And just to address any lingering doubt about who shot whom and who shot first, Breonna's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, shot at the cops first conclusively, not just according to ballistic evidence, but by admission from Walker himself.
Mr. Walker admitted that he fired one shot and was the first to shoot. In addition to all the testimony, the ballistics report shows that the round that struck Sergeant Mattingly was fired from a 9mm handgun. The LMPD officers fired 40 caliber handguns.
So to quickly summarize the facts, not just as the cops claim, but the facts as established by the evidence, Breonna Taylor and her residents were extensively involved in the drug operations of her ex-boyfriend, thus the legal and valid warrant for her apartment. Police knocked and announced themselves before entry, and her new boyfriend shot one of the cops, and the cops returned fire in self-defense. So why then was one cop charged with endangerment? Very simple. That cop was actually outside the apartment. He was in a different position, and he was never actually fired upon. But he did fire into the apartment, and his rounds penetrated into a neighboring unit. It wasn't reckless for the cops fired upon to return fire. It was reckless for an uninvolved neighboring unit to be endangered by a cop who was not directly fired upon. Thus, the differential treatment for the officers and the differential charges, at least in the judgment of the grand jury. So not a lot of mystery left, and no evidence whatsoever of any racial element in this case, which of course leaves the journalists at this press conference scrambling to maintain the racial narrative. Hey, black man, don't you understand black suffering?
What do you say to people who say this is just another example of the black community not getting full justice? And what specifically do you plan to do to calm a community that's long been hurting? And do you understand that anger that people might feel?
Surely that grand jury could not have been driven by the facts and the applicable law. So tell us, were they black enough?
What rule or standard prevents you from releasing the racial and gender makeup of the grand jury?
And what about your team, Mr. Black Attorney General? Are they black enough?
Give me an idea of the percentage of people of color on the team of investigators.
Well, I'm black, and I speak for the entire department.
It actually was exactly this sort of media malfeasance that prompted me to watch the full press conference in the first place. I didn't catch the event Wednesday, but I did see NBC's morning news coverage on Thursday, and I knew when the piece focused less on the AG's press conference itself and more on things like subjective racial pain.
Very rarely do black people get justice when it comes to police.
And yet more on protesters blocking traffic and claiming victimhood for it.
Even turning violent in Denver and Buffalo, where cars plowed into protesters.
That's all the more reason to watch the press conference for yourself and get the actually useful information. But the most egregious and misleading part of that coverage wasn't the actual reporting. It was the interview segment with Taylor family attorney Benjamin Crump. Yes, that Benjamin Crump, fresh off lying about Jacob Blake being a peaceful man just trying to break up a fight, and now spreading lies about this case too. And where he can't lie, he just spreads illegitimate doubt and confusion. Crump acts like there are no answers to the questions that he's asking, when in fact, every single one of them was answered at the Attorney General's press conference. So it's either that Crump didn't listen, but is still opining, or he knows damn well and is just misleading the public. You be the judge, but neither negligence nor malice are good looks for a supposed lawyer.
We're trying to figure out, what did the Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron present to the grand jury? Did he present any evidence for Breonna Taylor? And if he did, what was it to get an outcome like this?
The AG didn't present evidence for or against any party. The AG presented the evidence, and if you bothered to listen, he explained all of it. It was interviews with the cops and Kenneth Walker. It was witness testimony. It was ballistic evidence analyzed not by him, but by state officials and the FBI in a completely separate investigation.
We utilized information from the Kentucky State Police, local medical examiners, as well as working with the FBI crime lab to secure a trajectory analysis and ballistics report.
From disingenuous questions of fact to disingenuous defenses, Crump becomes a big Second Amendment fan, arguing that Breonna's boyfriend Kenneth Walker was just defending his castle.
Kenny Walker, who has a right to the Second Amendment like any other citizens, even if he's a black man, they thought it was intruders breaking into their home. He thought he was protecting his woman and his castle.
Well, first of all, even if we accept that theory, Kenneth Walker is currently a free man. He was initially charged with attempted murder for the cop he shot, but the DA dropped the charges in May. Where is the Second Amendment violation if the guy who supposedly exercised his rights wasn't charged or prosecuted? Regardless, he wasn't exercising his rights. You don't have a Second Amendment right to shoot cops serving a lawful warrant. The only plausible argument is there was confusion about who they were, but that seems unlikely given the cops knocking and announcing, and Kenneth Walker in a ready shooting stance the moment the door was breached. From obfuscating the facts to outright lying about them, Crump returns to the no-knock narrative.
Why didn't Daniel Cameron present to the grand jury anything about the lie in the probable cause affidavit to get the no-knock warrant that allowed them to be and bust in Breonna Taylor's apartment in the first place?
First, the complaint was, we know nothing about the evidence the AG presented the grand jury. Now the complaint is, we know the evidence presented is insufficient. You got to pick one. But more importantly, none of this is true. The warrant was legitimate. The cops were advised to knock and announce, and they did, and they were attacked. And if you call the cops liars, you got to call the independent witness a liar too. Going for the trifecta, Crump moves on from his terrible factual argument and his terrible philosophical argument to a terrible legal argument. It's hard to believe this one was made by an actual lawyer. He says that because there was wanton endangerment, there should be wanton murder too.
They had wanton endangerment for the white neighbor's apartment, but not for the bullets going into Breonna Taylor's body, nor did they have wanton endangerment for the bullets that went into the black neighbor's apartment above Breonna. We seem to have two justice systems in America, one for black America and one for white America. If you have wanton endangerment for somebody shooting blindly, wouldn't that rise to the occasion of wanton murder in Breonna's case?
Now, in full fairness, there are still some questions about the claims that rounds also hit a neighboring apartment above. The AG didn't get into that. But to the other claims of fact, this is absolute nonsense. If the rounds that hit the neighboring apartment were wanton endangerment, why aren't the rounds that hit Breonna wanton murder? Because the rounds that hit Breonna were fired in justified self-defense. Those rounds were fired after being fired upon. The rounds that were wanton endangerment never hit Breonna. How can you charge a guy with murder if he never killed anybody? This isn't a difference of black or white. It's a difference of shooting at the cops or not. The rounds that hit Breonna were fired justifiably. The rounds that hit the neighboring apartment were not. And as if this guy couldn't get any more insufferable, he passes off his own responsibility too. He wants other people to do his work for him.
Breonna's family would love to see the grand jury transcript to see if there was any evidence presented for Breonna Taylor's perspective.
You're the Taylor family attorney. It is your job to provide the evidence from Breonna's perspective. If you find that evidence lacking, why don't you get to work instead of sponging money off this family and producing nothing? But if there's anyone who competes closely with Crump in the negligence Olympics, it's this news team. Keep in mind the context here. They played almost none of the Attorney General's press conference. Instead, they gave this idiot several minutes of speaking time with no counterpoints. And worse still, the anchor, Craig Melvin, actually takes Crump's side and asks if there's any hope for federal justice.
How optimistic is the family that there may be some justice on the federal level?
That question presumes there wasn't justice in this case. Where was the injustice? Because as a matter of law, there was none. As a matter of morality, of course Breonna didn't deserve to die, but who is to blame for that outcome? If you shoot at people, they are justified in shooting back. So when will we apply some blame to the guy who shot first? When will we apply some blame to the ex-boyfriend who, along with Breonna, ran the drug operation behind the whole event? The goal here is not federal justice. Scrap national and instead think as locally as possible. Think personal justice. Phrased another way, think personal responsibility. There is no benevolent government intervention that could have solved what happened in this case better than personal responsibility could have. The personal responsibility not to engage in criminal enterprise. The personal responsibility not to associate with those who do. The personal responsibility not to shoot the cops when confronted for that association. And even if you do make all of those mistakes, the personal responsibility to accept responsibility when you do. From the activists in the street to Crump in the suit to Kenneth Walker, who's still somehow a free walker despite shooting a cop, we're hearing none of that. It would have been really nice to hear that question, not, hey, Benjamin Crump, any hope for federal justice? Instead, hey, Benjamin Crump, any hope for personal responsibility? But I guess maybe that would have been terrible journalism too, actually. After all, everybody already knows the answer to that question. Abdicating responsibility isn't just his legal defense strategy, it's his livelihood. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.